World War II is considered the bloodiest and most devastating conflict in human history. When people mention this 6-year war, they immediately think of its darkest chapters: the genocide of the Jewish people by Nazi Germany, the war crimes committed by the Japanese Empire, and the massive military campaigns of the Allied forces that claimed tens of millions of lives. But among countless horrifying events, none shocked the world more than the 2 atomic bombings carried out by the United States on Japan in August 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the victims of the most terrifying weapon humanity had ever created. These were also the first and only times nuclear bombs were used in actual warfare. The destructive power of these weapons surpassed anything imaginable at the time. They not only leveled entire cities within seconds but also left painful, long-lasting consequences for many generations, from radiation exposure and chronic illnesses to immeasurable physical and emotional loss. In this video, we will travel back to that pivotal moment to understand why the United States chose to use atomic bombs, what the situation was like at the time, and how Hiroshima and Nagasaki became turning points that reshaped the global order. In 1945, the Second World War was gradually approaching its final stage. The Allied forces launched a series of major offensives on both the Western and Eastern fronts, pushing back the Axis armies. On May 8, 1945, after Berlin fell and Nazi Germany signed an unconditional surrender, the war in Europe officially came to an end. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Front, the conflict continued to rage fiercely between the Allies and the Imperial Japanese Army. However, Japan found itself increasingly disadvantaged, especially after major defeats at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, along with a series of bombing campaigns targeting Japanese cities. The prospect of ending the war within 1945 seemed entirely possible. Despite this, Imperial Japan still had no intention of surrendering, even as casualties and civilian losses from bombings continued to rise. 66 Japanese cities had been bombed, approximately 1.7 million people lost their homes, and hundreds of thousands were killed or injured. Notably, the napalm bombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, killed at least 100,000 people. Yet just 2 days after the Tokyo bombing, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo expressed a view shared by many high-ranking officials, that the people would gradually get used to being bombed every day, and their unity and determination would only strengthen. However, the military reality was undeniable: the Imperial Japanese Army was almost incapable of withstanding the pressure from the Allies, especially the United States. The Navy and Air Force, Japan's core combat branches, had been nearly wiped out. Japan's industrial base was devastated, and the nation was being tightly blockaded. With few weapons left to resist, Japanese commanders relied on what they believed was their one remaining advantage: the samurai spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor. Early 1945 proved that the kamikaze suicide attacks were still effective. Although more than 3,900 pilots were sacrificed, the tactic inflicted considerable damage on the Allied Navy. By July 1945, Japan still had 12,725 aircraft, most of which were expected to be used as suicide planes. The Japanese military also drafted plans for an all-out national resistance. Besides kamikaze aircraft, Japan possessed several other suicide weapons at sea. Furthermore, Japan had approximately 3 million troops stationed abroad. In distant areas such as New Guinea, Indonesia, and Indochina the numbers were smaller, but Japan concentrated significant forces in China, especially in Manchuria and Korea. The core force was the Guangdong Army, with nearly 1 million soldiers. According to the summer 1945 campaign plan, if Japan fell in the homeland, this army would retreat to Manchuria and continue resistance. The Japanese government decided to fight to the last person and believed that the United States would be forced to abandon an invasion if its casualties became too heavy. They believed American public opinion would demand negotiations, allowing Japan to secure favorable ceasefire terms. On the Allied side, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted to President Truman an invasion plan called Operation Downfall, consisting of 2 phases: Operation Olympic and Operation Coronet, beginning with extensive carpet bombing conducted by American aircraft based in China and Korea. The U.S. estimated enormous casualties, 100,000 in Operation Olympic and 250,000 in Operation Coronet. However, the successful test of the first atomic bomb, Trinity, on July 16, 1945, introduced a faster and far more devastating solution to force Japan into unconditional surrender, bombing Japan with atomic weapons. Shortly afterward, from July 17 to August 2, representatives of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom met at the Potsdam Conference to discuss major wartime issues, including the rapid defeat of Japan. On July 26, the US, UK, and the Republic of China issued the Potsdam Declaration, a final ultimatum demanding Japan's immediate unconditional surrender. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide adequate and proper assurances of their good faith. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. On July 26, Japan received the declaration, and conflicting opinions arose among its leadership. The government offered no clear response, while the militarist faction insisted that the declaration was arrogant and should be rejected. On the afternoon of July 28, during a government meeting, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki stated that he had no comment on the declaration and that Japan would continue the war. With Japan's refusal to surrender, the United States made its final decision, to use atomic bombs to end the war as quickly as possible. The developments on the Pacific Front and the Japanese government's hesitation toward the Potsdam Declaration led to the United States' decision to use atomic bombs to force Tokyo to end the war. But a key question arose: where would the U.S. deploy this devastating new weapon? In early spring 1945, the U.S. military convened a committee of senior officers and scientists to select a suitable target for the first atomic bombing. The committee identified two main objectives: to threaten Japan into unconditional surrender, and at the same time demonstrate to the world the power of an entirely new type of weapon. Historian Alex Wellerstein noted that at the time, the U.S. was still debating questions such as whether to strike a densely populated city or a military base, or whether merely demonstrating the bomb's power without causing casualties would be sufficient. Meanwhile, physicist Edward Teller argued that only by letting the world witness the consequences firsthand would people understand that if the war continued, the destruction would be far worse. For this purpose, using the atomic bomb in an actual combat scenario was considered the most optimal option. By May 1945, the proposed list of targets included Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kakura. The committee dismissed purely military targets due to the high risk of missing when bases were located within residential areas, while emphasizing the psychological impact on the Japanese population as equally important. They also agreed that the first detonation must be prepared with extreme precision because its influence would extend globally. Kyoto was chosen because it was the ancient capital and a major cultural center of Japan. Hiroshima was a large city and a key military logistics hub. Tokyo was excluded because it had already been heavily devastated in the napalm bombing on March 9. After extensive debate, Kyoto was ultimately removed to avoid a severe backlash from attacking a historic cultural center. Therefore, the target shifted to Hiroshima, followed by Kakura and Nagasaki in case Japan still refused to surrender. At the time, Hiroshima held significant military, industrial importance. It housed various command units such as the 5th Division, the 2nd General Army under Field Marshal Hada Shunraku, along with numerous depots and weapons assembly facilities. General Spaatz also reported that the city had virtually no prisoner-of-war camps, further convincing Washington to designate it as the primary target. On the morning of August 6, 1945, 3 B-29 aircraft appeared over Hiroshima. 2 carried imaging and measuring equipment, while the remaining 1, Enola Gay, carried the bomb. Radar stations detected only 3 aircraft and therefore issued no interception orders. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay opened, and less than a minute later, Hiroshima was engulfed in an unimaginable flash. The little boy bomb detonated at an altitude of about 600 meters, with a destructive force equivalent to 13,000 tons of TNT. Approximately 90,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more died from burns, radiation, and shock. The radius of direct destruction was 1.6 kilometers, fires spread across more than 4.4 square kilometers. By the end of the year, the death toll had risen to about 140,000, and for decades afterward more victims continued to perish due to radiation effects. Following the attack, the U.S. warned that if Japan continued to resist, it would face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. On August 8, the U.S. dropped 6 million leaflets over 47 major Japanese cities, describing the power of the atomic bomb and urging civilians to pressure the emperor to end the war. However, the Japanese government still did not provide a clear response. They continued to consider 4 conditions for surrender: maintaining the imperial system, retaining control over disarmament, preventing Allied occupation, and allowing Japan to handle its own war crime trials. On August 5, the Soviet Union announced the termination of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. A few minutes after midnight on August 8, Tokyo time, the Red Army launched a massive offensive against Japan's Guangdong Army in Manchuria. And at dawn on August 9, Tokyo received the official declaration of war. Because Japan still refused to surrender, the U.S. decided to deploy the second bomb, this time targeting Nagasaki, a major port city and an important industrial and naval center in southern Japan that had not yet suffered large-scale bombing. On the morning of August 9, the B-29 Boxcar carried the Fat Man bomb. After several air raid alerts and cancellations, at 11:01 a.m., the bomb was released over the city's industrial valley and detonated 43 seconds later at an altitude of about 469 meters. Its destructive force was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. Because the bomb exploded between 2 main industrial districts and slightly off the residential area, the level of destruction was lower than Hiroshima despite its greater power. Even so, about 70,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more were severely injured. Fires spread over 3 kilometers from the detonation point. The 2 bombs claimed at least 160,000 lives, not counting the countless people who later died from radiation. The U.S. had even prepared plans for additional bombings if Japan continued its resistance. But the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ultimately forced the emperor and Japanese leaders to change their decision. In August 1945, Japan stood at a historic crossroads. After years of fighting across the Pacific, the nation was exhausted, its major cities devastated. But the true turning point came when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people within seconds. At the same time, the Soviet Union launched a sudden offensive against the Guangdong Army, Japan's strongest remaining force, pushing the country into an even more desperate situation. The Japanese government fell into crisis, deeply divided between those determined to fight to the end and those urging immediate surrender to save the nation from annihilation. Eventually, facing the threat of complete destruction, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation for the first time in history and accepted unconditional surrender under the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. But it was not until September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, that Japanese representatives officially signed the instrument of surrender before the United States and the Allied powers, marking the definitive end of World War II. It was a moment that changed the world, closing the chapter on a devastating conflict while leaving behind lessons humanity must never forget. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so I can continue creating high-quality history content. Thank you for watching until the end.